Making a quick video about the voting process in Australia and then following that up by showing the other side of an argument, I'm sure this will go down well with the general public. Oh. Okay, so recently I made a video about the voting process in the upcoming Australian election, and more than half the video was a reaction to another big YouTuber. And it blew up. Well, for my standards anyway. But damn, people were not happy about it. So let's talk about it in this video. But first, why am I even making this video? Am I really that upset over some comments from some people who I've never even met before? Am I trying to defend myself so I don't look like an idiot? Am I trying to farm more engagement for that sweet, sweet subscriber growth and ad revenue? Am I really a partisan for one major political party that I want to win? Well, the primary reason is to justify myself. The reason is the comments were overwhelmingly against me, which is fine. People are entitled to their own opinions. However, if you're a newer viewer, or even a regular on my channel who isn't even from Australia, like a lot of you aren't, and you watch that video, then see all the comments, it makes me look like a dipshit. Because, like any video, if you start watching it, scroll to sus comments, and they say stuff like, "Oh, this guy's so dumb, lol," then as the viewer, you're going to be like, "Oh well, this guy's no clue what he's talking about. He's an idiot." Well, I'll justify myself in this video, then feel free to make the conclusion if I'm an idiot or not. But why was there such a negative buzz around the video? Well, both sides, myself and the viewers, got things wrong. I should have been more clear with what the point of the reaction was, as well as my reasons why, and the viewers totally missed what the point was. Like you guys were shooting a shot from the moon, that's how badly you missed the point. The point was to show the other side of an argument, which a certain big YouTuber does not. He presents one side of an argument. I presented the other side of the argument, but then people come and call me biased/wrong. I should have done a better job at explaining why I'm right, or at least why I see things the way I do, as some comments pointed out. However, relating to the bias thing, isn't that interesting? So I'm not allowed to be biased, but FriendlyJordies is? Isn't that interesting? Rules for thee, not for me. That was the point I was trying to show, which funnily enough got proven in the comments. Now I also want to say I'm not upset at these comments/the engagement. I was actually super appreciative. Why? One, because a lot of comments were actually insightful/intelligent, and I learned something. And two, because it's engagement. For the first time in months, I had growth in my subscriber count. Only a handful were as a result of the actual video, but I'm thinking maybe that was some people's first video they'd seen from my channel, and from there they had to suss at some other stuff. Then while they were watching another video, then they decided to subscribe. It's either that, a coincidence that I got an increase in sub count at the time that video was popping off, or people were subscribing due to a recent net worth video I made. Usually those videos don't do so well because a lot of people, understandably, don't give a shit about net worth. But I know there's a niche out there on YouTube of people who enjoy the whole personal finance thing. That's the audience I'm trying to capture. I know they're out there. I just got to keep trying until I get an algorithm hit. I also received a lot of negative comments ages ago from criticizing some self-improvement YouTuber, although the comments in my recent vid were more negative than that one. But now that criticism has aged really well. But at the time, his fanboys attacked me trying to say I'm an idiot, without actually providing any proof as to why. So I've had this before. Natural part of making a video criticizing someone, you'll get hate from their fanboys. But those videos got me some extra sub growth. So you take the bad with the good. I would prefer if more people liked what I had to say, purely because they'd obviously subscribe if they did, rather than disliking and dipping, but given how stagnant the growth was lately, I'll take it, and I'd do it again, to be honest. But yeah, point is, as a content creator, there's no such thing as bad publicity. From my perspective, I'd rather have 100 negative viewers if it gets me 5 extra subscribers, rather than 100 neutral viewers if it gets me 0 subscribers. I personally don't care about the slander online. I can do this amazing thing. It's called not checking the YouTube Studio app or checking my channel. During the whole blow up in that video, it was on the weekend. I worked 9 hours, both weekend days, at my part-time supermarket job at Woolies. And we had so much free Easter food and shit in the tea room, I was too busy working and eating free chocolates and hot cross buns to give a shit. I also had gym, but that was only like an hour and a half out of the whole weekend. Point is, I wasn't glued to my laptop/phone screen all weekend. Some comments I received were pretty stupid, which I have no issue clapping back at, but I just clap back and move on to the next comment. Most of the viewers had never seen me before, so basically, about me, I'm a CPA, aka obviously I'm smart and studied hard throughout my life. I make more than 6 figures a year from my 2 jobs, aka I worked hard and earned my way into both of my jobs. I didn't get either of them via nepotism, had to go through the job applications, interviews, resume process myself. No daddy that owns the company, or best buddy that's a manager at the big company, or no uncle's business I got a job at. Yeah, the Woolies gig isn't something that was super hard to get, but have you seen the labor market? Having this very stable job is something heaps of people wish they had. My net worth is closing in on $300,000, meaning I worked hard and was smart with my money for years on end. I'm pretty jacked/aesthetic, aka I have testosterone in my body, which will feed into an argument I'll debunk later, and also obviously have worked hard physically over the years. I'm quite well versed in the whole stock market/real estate market/economics thing, which I'll prove later in the video, despite what some others in the prior comments said. AKA, I'm not a one-trick pony that only knows stuff relating to his job, and I have a monetized YouTube channel, which yes is not super large at all, generates barely any money. You'd be better off working a couple of extra hours at your wagey job, but stacking that on top of all the other stuff I've done, again, shows I work hard, or at the very least, I'm productive with my downtime. I'm too proud to take bullshit from someone who doesn't even give a good reason why I'm wrong/calls me an idiot without any substance. If I'm an idiot, how about you? What did you study? What does your physique look like? How much do you make a year? What's your net worth? If you're so much smarter than me, surely you've got your own house, you're more educated, you have a higher net worth, you have a better body than me, right? It'd be pretty embarrassing if you were in worse shape, poorer, less educated, didn't have your own house, etc., if an idiot like myself could do that, right? But even then, engagement is engagement, which I appreciate as a content creator. Now watch someone make a comment on how I'm a narcissist without actually debunking anything I've done. Now another reason why I'm making this follow-up is most of the comments occurred over a certain weekend in which I worked at my second job. And at one point I'm stacking the shelves with my friend/coworker, and eventually politics comes up as the convo topic. And he goes, I've been watching this guy on YouTube lately who talks about politics. His name is FriendlyJordies. Have you heard of him? And I'm like, damn, what a coincidence, lol. So I say, yeah, I've heard of him. He does talk about politics sometimes. And my friend goes, yeah, I've been listening to him. And I'm like, damn, is this my opinion now? And at that point, I'm like, okay, I need to make a follow-up video. I was kind of 50-50 on a follow-up, but I need to make another one because I know for a fact that my friend is not the only one who's going to listen to FriendlyJordies, who is obviously biased towards one party, and not even consider the other side, which was the point I was trying to make in the last video, but I didn't do a good job at explaining the other side, and everyone else totally missed the point. So before we continue, a TLDR is I was arguing points for the Liberals in my last video to show the other side of the argument since Jordies only argues points for Labour, and the comments also only really argued in points for Labour. However, I don't care about either party, I'm voting third parties as my preference, and hey, guess what? I actually want Labour to win at this rate, which is something the comments clearly wanted. Why? Because I have money on them. I did some digging into prior political polls at this stage in the election, what policies were argued for both sides, checking what the sentiment was at the time, any controversies involved, and at the time of making those bets, it seemed like a sure bet that Labour was going to get in based off of historical data. It's the same thing I did for the US election, and that was some fat profits I made from that. Easy money. I also financially benefit more from Labour getting in simply due to their HECS debt cut, providing they actually make good on that promise. Even then, because I have student debt and my own house, no matter who wins, I benefit in one way or another. After that video was made, the campaign officially started and both parties introduced new policies. I'm not going to talk much about them because who knows what other policies will come out after making this video. However, I will say Both parties' policies are only set to increase house prices further. Why? Because you're pumping more money into the property market. I've given a brief summary to AI because it's just way easier to explain. And hey, look, I've included both political parties' recent policies. Labor's shared ownership idea and the Liberals' interest deductions. No bias here. Basically, AI is saying it increases demand and doesn't address supply. Yes, because you're pumping money into property, which Sunrise actually mentioned in an interview with Dutton recently.
If you're a first home buyer and you think, okay, this is great, I can deduct that money, but how is it going to increase supply? Because the 101 of economics is if you increase supply, the price will come down. We need supply in this country.
Now, yeah, we do need more supply, but why do we need more supply? Because there's a lot more demand. Why is there a lot of demand? Gee, I don't know, because there's been a net increase of hundreds of thousands of people over the past couple of years. Yet there's been far less extra housing supply coming on during this excessive immigration. I will talk a little bit later about the supply data, but first let's look at immigration levels. It's hard to find the exact data of net overseas migration. Some figures say, oh, there was a net of 500,000 this particular year, but another data set says, oh, it was 550,000 or 450,000, but the trend is clear. There has been way more of a net population increase compared to the prior years. You can see that in the graph here over the past couple of years. The population as a percentage has increased at a higher rate on average compared to the prior decade. Yeah, it's not an off-the-charts surge, but when you're talking about numbers as large as a country's population size, the slight increases make a huge difference. It's the same way how margins for Woolies and Coles aren't even that huge, but at that scale, it makes an enormous difference when you compare their margins to other supermarkets in other countries such as Walmart, Kroger's, Tesco, Sainsbury. You might be thinking, oh, well, population increased because we had babies. Babies don't need new houses. Immigration wasn't the reason why. Well, look at this data point. The births registered has slowly declined. There are a few reasons why, but most notably is people just can't afford to have kids anymore. There's also reasons such as the lack of quality in the dating market, something I will talk a lot about in an upcoming video. But look at any video delving into this topic, and most couples who want kids haven't had them. The primary reason is they can't afford it, but that's not the point of this video. The reason this is an important data point to mention is perhaps the population has increased because we all suddenly had heaps of babies. Well, babies don't need their own new home, so there'd be no extra real demand for new houses, since you would assume people would have their baby live in their current rental/home/apartment/whatever. Yeah, maybe some people want to upsize to have more space for their family, but then they'd be selling their old place and buying a new one. Net overall supply remains the same, but that is not the case. So the population has increased, but not due to more babies, aka humans that do not add to demand for housing. So, lower birth rates coupled with higher immigration leads to an overall net increase in the population. That requires housing. Okay, so I've established that there's been way more people who've come into the country that have added demand for housing. Well, we have a problem with supply. So how's the supply situation looking? Well, not good. Now the data here from the ABS shows commencements have gone down. There's another line here in this chart for housing approvals, which although it has some relevance, it's not as important as commencements. I had housing approval months ago, but that doesn't mean much unless construction actually starts. In some cases you can get everything ready, but you have some problem between having the approval versus the home builder actually commencing construction. But they're closely correlated enough anyway. No matter how you look at it, there are less houses being built over the past few years. Here's another point of data. This one is from the HIA. If you don't know the HIA, they're very involved in the building industry, so they know what they're doing. You have to sign a contract with them before your house begins construction, and their data shows commencements of housing, not approvals, commencements were quite low. So yes, there is a supply issue in Australia, and there especially has been for the past few years. Who was in charge of the country the last few years? Oh, that's right, Labor was. So why did housing commencements decrease under their watch? I'll answer that question shortly, but let's check out this first. Labor had a plan called the Housing Australia Future Fund, and the idea was to build more affordable housing with $10 billion. Well, they've literally built none. How is that even possible? Again, I'll answer that question later. They had stated they built 340 homes, well short of their 30,000 target, and to make matters worse, they're running into financial troubles. Basically, they had $10 billion to work with, and they would draw down on the gains from this investment. Example, if we gain $500 million a year from this, which is only a 5% gain per year, they could use this $500 million to build houses. However, bad financial management has meant their investment has fallen below $10 billion. This means their existing funds need to return a higher amount than 5% to generate the $500 million per year. So this is controlled by the Future Fund Board. This is independent of the government, aka it's not Labor who controls this. And this board has stated they have no obligation to actually ensure the fund stays above $10 billion. Wow, what a nice financial management job, hey? Labor goes to these guys, hey, can you look after my $10 billion? The Future Fund Board goes, okay. The value of the investment goes down below $10 billion. Labor goes, what the fuck? I thought you were supposed to look after my money. The board goes, we have no obligation to ensure its value stays above what you gave us. Sheesh. Now, as mentioned earlier in the vid, I literally do this stock trading thing myself. So I'm aware of portfolio risk, balancing, stocks are riskier than bonds, but bonds offer lower returns than stocks generally, etc. Even I would know to rebalance the portfolio and have a much more defensive stance once uncertainty was introduced into the market, such as a new president in the largest economy in the world. Back in 2018, when we had tariff wars, the market dipped substantially, so why the hell would you have a lot of money in the markets if you needed a certain investment return amount in the near future? If this is a real long-term strategy, then just hold. Markets are overreacting right now, but it's legislated that they withdraw $500 million from this. This is a problem since too much of the fund is invested into the markets, and if you withdraw capital when its value is lower, you now have a lower amount that needs to grow to sustain your $500 million in withdrawals per year. Example, $10 billion investment makes 5% per year, which is a $500 million gain. The amount of the fund is now $10 billion, $500 million. You withdraw $500 million from this fund, the fund is now valued at $10 billion, back to square one. However, if the fund drops to $9 billion and you withdraw $500 million, the fund is now valued at $8.5 billion. In order for this fund to get back up to $10 billion, you would need a return of 17.65%, and that's just to get back to your original investment. If you wanted to get to $10.5 billion from $8.5 billion, because you need the extra buffer to draw on, that's an increase of 23.53%, pretty unlikely in a single year. Only about 6 of the past 20 years have returned amounts that large, and if you have a really bad year in the markets, which we're overdue for by the way, that makes my prior example even worse. If your fund goes down to $8.5 billion and it dips even further to something like $7.5 billion, you're going to need mammoth returns. And considering the fund has investments in property, infrastructure and timberland, credit, cash and alternatives, with 64% of their alternatives invested in low beta relative value, which is basically a really safe investment, alongside all the others I listed, you're not going to be making enormous returns. You can find what they're invested in by going onto their website and looking at the most recent annual report. Now, I said earlier this isn't Labor's fault that the Future Fund can invest properly, which is true. What I would have done is gone heavy into bonds before Inauguration Day. Based on what AI says about what returns bonds were offering at the time, this was really close to the 5% return they would have needed. And hey, guess what? You would have been invested heavily into the markets throughout the 2024 surge anyway. So you would have had way more than your 5% return needed off your $10 billion investment to generate $500 billion in growth to draw on for the year. And this isn't a, oh, I swear I would have done this, bro, trust me. No, this is a common sense approach to those who want to mitigate risk. It's not like, oh, I would have invested heavily into Philip Morris. Like, how are you supposed to know that that stock would be performing well this year? No, going heavy on bonds is a pretty standard investment strategy for risk management. Everyone in the whole stock market/finance space knows this. And I also know that this comment is going to pop up. Let me guess, it's a certain someone's fault that the stock market has been volatile lately. let's just blame someone else instead of having a smarter investment strategy. It's always someone else's fault, isn't it? Maybe if you were smart like me, you would have had a better financial strategy. It's like boomers are complaining that their super funds are taking in value. If you were that close to retirement, you should have had much more invested in cash and bonds. Literally everyone in the finance space knows this. Consider that an expensive lesson on getting your finances in order instead of just hoping things run smoothly. An expensive lesson. Now, there's probably reasons why a fund can invest 100% into something, which can be an odd policy depending on how you look at it. If you have to diversify your portfolio so much, then your portfolio becomes almost the exact same as most other super fund portfolios. There'd only be a slight difference, such as having 23% in domestic stocks instead of 24%. There's roughly $1.3 billion in annual costs, and at least they're getting paid out of the fund's earnings, not the taxpayer's dime. However, you could easily cut some workers' salaries here and reinvest those funds further. What is the point of a specialized financial advisor working at these institutions when they are told to follow specific investment breakdowns anyway? But whatever, this argument will be a bit relevant later when I go into the rebuttals section. But my point is, this is not Labor's fault. The fund performing badly is not Labor's fault. But taxpayers may need to top up this amount. And for what? Some failing plan that's built 0 new houses? Lol. So the point of that was to show supply isn't going so well. Labor had a plan to build more houses using some investment strategy that isn't working, and even then, their plan only produced 340 homes. And you've had 1.5 years. There's some under construction and some in the planning stages, but they are incredibly behind target. So it's not Labor's fault the finances suck, but it is their fault the supply isn't growing. Oh wait, is it? Well, turns out the Coalition and Greens are the ones blocking progress in Parliament, or the Senate. Although Labor is running the show, other parties are to blame for stalling progress. So yeah, not totally Labor's fault that supply isn't keeping up. It is kind of their responsibility though. But how do they end up with 340 revamped houses in 1.5 years? Pretty damn slow progress. If the Coalition/Greens blocked everything, how did they get this 340 figure then? The other parties kind of blocked everything. How do you only have 340 houses to show for it in such a large span of time? But whatever, that's not the point I'm getting at. So I spent ages talking about the increase in population, the lack of supply and the finances associated with it, as well as the issues in Parliament. Okay, so Labor isn't at fault then, right? Nope, Labor still has lots of blame. Why? Because of the excessive immigration. If there wasn't such a huge surge in demand from people coming into the country, the lack of supply wouldn't be an issue because there wouldn't be a heap of demand for said supply. So why didn't Labor slow the flow of migrants while they got the supply stuff online? All you Labor partisans, please explain. I just spent ages defending your party. Now I have introduced a criticism of said party. Now defend this. Why did they keep the immigration taps running so high if they couldn't get the supply on track? Wouldn't you just slow immigration until you knew you could get supply back on track? Are you going to just blame everyone else, or are you going to accept some accountability? Let me guess, it's always someone else's fault. If this is your argument, you're further proving my point I made in my last video. So much bias towards one party or another, no one has any critical thinking skills. So now we're going to go over quite a few arguments against me, and I will justify myself, and I'll do a much better job at explaining why I'm right, or at least why I think I'm right. These arguments against me stemmed from the comments in the prior video. One common argument I got was immigration is good, immigration is fine, immigration is not the cause of the housing crisis. Now the reason I didn't elaborate on it at the time is because I assumed it was common sense, supply versus demand. If you have a lot more demand for accommodation, aka bringing in new people to the country, and the amount of accommodation isn't enough to support everyone coming in, then obviously prices increase. But apparently this is not common sense. Now, some counter-arguments to this were, a study done showed only 1 to 4% of housing being owned by migrants, we had no immigration during the pandemic and house prices still went up, migrants who come here generally live with their families, and immigration is needed to cover the skills shortage. Now I'm going to play a segment from an economics channel called LeafVo. I will put a timestamp if you want to skip it, but I'm going to briefly summarize what he says in the end. So don't be typing in the comments saying I had no source for the data/comments I make. Everything you need to hear is in that video segment that I'll play. So here goes. And I will give a TLDR of the video if you just want to skip it.
Now, you may recall on Monday I spoke to the Greens MP for Griffith, Max Chandler-Mather. He said targeting migrants was scapegoating.
We think that's scapegoating a group that's not responsible for the crisis. There's a good study out now that demonstrates that international students aren't the culprits of the housing crisis. We saw during COVID where we had net negative migration. So migration was not only zero, it was going backwards. And house prices increased at some of the fastest rates in this country's history. And that's because as long as the federal government is giving out hundreds of billions of dollars in tax handouts to property investors with sometimes 10, 20, 30 properties, that will drive up the price of housing and lock out first home buyers.
Greens MP for the Brisbane electorate of Griffith blaming property investors. Leith Van Onselen, economist, disagrees.
The inconvenient truth here that he isn't talking about conveniently is the rental market. That is the impact. That is the area where the impact from immigration is the highest.
So is the study that Max Chandler-Mather cited to me as good on Monday actually worth the paper it's written on? Leith Van Onselen, who's an economist, worked at Treasury, both Australia and Victoria, has had a look at the data. I asked Max Chandler-Mather to provide me the data. He provided me a Guardian newspaper article which cites the data from the Property Council and a university in South Australia. So I asked Leith Van Onselen to look at that data from the Property Council cited by the Guardian newspaper to support his claim. I asked Leith Van Onselen if the Greens MP Max Chandler-Mather is correct.
No, it doesn't, Steve. It's actually, those are complete junk studies that have been debunked by myself and many others in the property industry and other experts. The fact of the matter is Max Chandler-Mather likes to talk about house prices, and the reason why prices obviously rose during the pandemic was because interest rates collapsed. The cash rate went down to 0.25%. But it's also interesting to note that after immigration was rebooted and interest rates actually soared, house prices went up. And that's because demand rocketed. And the inconvenient truth here that he isn't talking about conveniently is the rental market. That is the impact. That is the area where the impact from immigration is the highest. And we saw at the beginning of the pandemic when a lot of international students and temporary migrants left, rents actually fell. And then as soon as immigration rebounded to record levels, rents soared across Australia. And we have arguably the worst rental crisis in modern history as a result.
Does the data back that up from authoritative sources? I know the Education Department released some data on this, and you've had a look through the fact sheet that they released. What does that say?
Yeah, so the Education Department basically debunked the Property Council study and said that international students were taking up around 7% of rental homes on the private rental market. Now that was a conservative estimate. It wasn't even the more realistic estimate. And what the Education Department said is that yes, that was having a direct impact on rents, and the data is unequivocal. The data shows and I've done it, and as of many others, if you plot the migration rate against the rental growth, there's almost a direct one-for-one correlation. So when migration falls, rental growth falls, and when migration rises, and it's obviously surged in the last few years, rents have surged. This is not rocket science. Migrants do not arrive in Australia with a house in their backpack, and contrary to popular belief, migrants overwhelmingly do not work in construction. So according to the actual data from the study from the Grattan Institute, only 2.8% of migrants that have arrived in the last 5 years work in the construction workforce, and that compares to them taking up 4.4% of all jobs in Australia. So migrants are far less likely to work in construction than the locally born population. What this means is that when you increase migration, you massively increase demand for housing, but you don't do anything to benefit the supply side, and that is the fundamental reason why we have this chronic housing shortage.
Peter Dutton, the opposition leader, has committed to cutting new migrant numbers by 100,000 people each year, temporarily, but he'd impose the cut straight away if elected. And the concern is, A, that would be scapegoating migrants, B, we wouldn't have the skills we need, and C, it won't solve the housing and rental crisis. How do you see it, Leith Van Onselen?
Well, I actually think they should cut a lot harder, Steve, to be quite frank. So to the first point, obviously if you cut the flow of migration, you are going to cut the demand for housing, which is a good thing in a housing shortage. The fact of the matter is, under the federal government's own projections, the Centre for Population, Australia is supposed to add 13.5 million people in the next 40 years. That is the equivalent of adding a Sydney, a Melbourne and a Brisbane. So imagine all the houses in Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane right now and all the infrastructure and all the energy and water supplies needed. We're supposed to add that in another 40 years. Now, obviously, if we keep going down this road of high immigration, we're never going to have enough houses, infrastructure, anything else, and our living standards are going to fall, and we're going to have this perpetual housing crisis. As to the argument about skills shortages, that isn't complete furphy, because this century, Australia has grown its population by 8.5 million people. We've had the strongest growth in the advanced world, by over 40%. and our skills shortages are worse than ever. And that tells you that migration does not solve skills shortages. It doesn't solve it because you can import a whole bunch of people to solve one problem, for example, say a lack of nurses, but then you just create problems in other areas, i.e. a lack of builders. So you just substitute one shortage for another. It's a massive game of whack-a-mole.
The Business Council of Australia, like the big business lobby, is pressuring all sides of politics for this. It's that pressure for the skilled migrants is coming from the Business Council of Australia. Do they not see? Why would they get that wrong? They employ them in theory.
Yeah, absolutely. And the big business, big property, the education industry, they all love big migration because it expands demand for what they're selling. So, education, property, if you're Harvey Norman, you sell more retail goods, etc. It's an easy way, it's a lazy way to grow the economy. And in the case of business, it also provides them with a broader pool of workers to employ, which can put some downward pressure on rents as well. So for them, it's a tick-tick. Mm-hmm. It increases demand for their products. It also puts some downward pressure on wages, which reduces their wage costs at the margin, which means they make more profits. And in the case of universities, they love international students because they get the revenue from it, and they can pay their vice-chancellors over $1 million a year at our expense.
My guest is Leith Van Onselen, Chief Economist at the MB Fund at MB Super. He's co-founder of macrobusiness.com.au. He's previously worked at the Australian Treasury, the Victorian Treasury, and in the private sector as well. This is 612 ABC Brisbane. Well, then let's take a look at Canada. So Canada, very similar to Australia, had high levels of migration, but Canada decided saw a reduction in migration. What occurred in their rental market? What lessons do we get from Canada, if any?
Yeah, that's a great point, Steve. I've actually got an article on macrobusiness.com.au on this very issue today. So in Canada experienced their biggest ever migration boom, similar to Australia after the pandemic. And as a result, their rental vacancy rate collapsed to a record low. Their rents rose to record levels, and it created this massive housing crisis, among other things. And the Canadian government last year announced a freeze on immigration for 3 years. And as a result, population growth in Canada has slowed to a crawl. And surprise, surprise, average asking rents across Canada have now declined for 6 straight months. And in this article that I've posted, there are charts plotting immigration and population growth against rents, and there is a direct correlation like in Australia. And now rental inflation is plummeting in Canada following immigration plummeting. None of this is rocket science. Obviously, if you're going to import hundreds of thousands of people into your housing market every year, you're going to need a lot of homes. They don't come with the homes attached to their backpack, and you're going to create pressure in the housing market. If you take that pressure off, rental inflation falls. It's as simple as that. This is basic supply and demand, which Max Chandler Mather, refuses to acknowledge, and he just plays the racism card every single time.
So, how much did Canada cut their internal? How much did they cut their migration by? Do you know?
Yeah. So basically, Canada's population growth in the 2003-2004 financial year was 3%. It was absolutely absurd, and they announced that over the next 3 years, Canada is only going to grow its population in total by 0.3%. So effectively, they're going to freeze the population for 3 years. They're in the process. They announced it last year. They implemented the measures last year. It's obviously working through the system right now. But at the moment, their population growth has slowed to an absolute crawl, almost nothing. And as a result, the pressures come off the rental market. Their housing construction rates are now in line with population growth. And the rental market is easing. They've had 6 consecutive months of rental price falls in Canada. And their rental inflation, which is measured as part of the CPI inflation, their annual rental inflation is halved and it's plummeting now. So this is direct evidence that immigration has a one-for-one impact on the rental market. If you massively increase population growth, you're going to drive down rental vacancy rates, you're going to push up rents. If you do the opposite will happen. None of this is rocket science.
Basically, that study on international students having no impact on housing prices or next to no impact on housing prices, well, the rental market is where they most impact the housing market, not the actual house prices themselves, but with the higher rent costs, renters struggle to afford a down payment. House prices surged during the pandemic, even though we had no immigration, because of the excessive money supply. They continued to surge even after rates went up and the money printing stopped. Due to immigration, both factors were simply high demand. Whether that be because way more people could afford more properties due to having way more money, or because of the way more people coming into the country. Canada has cut immigration recently and their rental costs have actually decreased. Some migrants may come here and move in with existing family, but there is zero evidence showing that they all have somewhere to live as soon as they step foot off the plane. Obviously, a lot of them will need a separate place to live, which adds demand for housing, thus making the problem worse. And immigration doesn't solve a skills shortage, since we've had skill shortages for decades now. If you want to argue any of these stats, go find the data to support your claim, since apparently I'm meant to source every single claim, yet you guys are allowed to spew whatever nonsense you want in my comments section. I never said immigration was bad, but too much is. Also, I mentioned at one point how it's easier to cut flights from 2 specific countries rather than building a whole new house. And someone made a racism remark. Surprise, surprise, if you dare mention cutting immigration or mentioning where the migrants are from, you're automatically racist. Well, guess what? I'm Asian. I'm not some Centrelink dole-bludging white boy who's complaining that the immigrants are taking my job. They took our job! And I also like how if you mention where the migrants are mostly coming from, that's racist. How? All I did was point out how most of the immigration came from 2 specific countries. Am I wrong? Go for a walk around Melbourne or Sydney and tell me what ethnicity most people you see walking around are. I never said it was bad, I just pointed it out. Funny how you woke types are quick to call everything racist. Projecting much? Why is that always at the top of your mind? Next argument, I have a house, so Jordies is wrong. Apparently me being rich enough to buy a house means my arguments against another biased guy are invalid. Funny since they did not even provide a single reason why I was wrong. One argument was like, you put Russian propaganda in your video lol. I asked what they were referring to, and no response. So like I said earlier, you're a casual viewer, you come and see my video, and you see comments like that are just negative and provide no substance, and it makes me look like I'm the one who has no idea what I'm talking about, despite the fact, in this case, they're the ones who have no idea what they're talking about. If you can let me know what Russian propaganda I put in that video is, I'd be keen to hear what it was. Next argument, was there even any research done in this video? Well, yes, actually at the end I digged into a data point that was used in the Jordies video. Some comments I made such as spending millions on pandas, or a few $100s in tax cuts, or the PM buying an expensive house. Well yeah, I didn't do too much research, but what do I need to research? What research is required on saying spending millions on pandas is a dumb idea? One argument I had was that I'm biased, and that everyone has bias. Yeah, so this is a good point. Obviously, all humans have bias. What I was trying to say was, I'm not a partisan for either major party. Never cared for either political party in the past, obviously. And contrary to what the comments say, I actually did argue both sides for both parties earlier in the video. But isn't that interesting? Jordies can be blatantly biased towards Labour, no one cares. But I can argue in favour of the other party in one reaction video, everyone cries. Next argument, you can't make an opinion if this is your first election, / predicting a winner isn't the same as knowing how policies will impact people. So instead of actually debunking stuff I said, some dimwits were like, well, can't talk if this is your first election, yet they didn't provide a single argument as to why I was wrong. I guess I didn't make it clear in the last video, but for instance, any housing policy either party introduces to help homebuyers will only increase house prices, which is what I mentioned earlier in this video. I also actually mentioned the impact of Dutton's nuclear policy earlier in the video too, but no, that argument doesn't matter since this is the first election you paid attention to. I also noted my prediction of the US election winner and how I got that right, and some people are like, oh, that isn't the same. Well, guess what? It was still better than you. You just came into my comments saying that I'm wrong because this is my first election, yet you never said why I was wrong. Example, I mentioned how preferential voting works in Australia. Was I wrong on how that worked? No, I wasn't. But again, nope, this is your first election, so your opinion doesn't matter. I'm not giving an example of why you were wrong because I'm a FriendlyJordies dick rider. Now, one argument I received was actually a smart one, gas reservation in the Northern Territory. I mentioned how I liked the gas reservation policy, and someone said it would impact the Northern Territory in a negative way. I wasn't educated on this, so this was an interesting point to bring up. This is how you argue your point. You say, you were wrong on this topic and here's why, not, oh, this is your first election, you don't know anything, or you're an idiot. Now, although this wasn't really an argument, it was part of a huge comment that received a lot of likes, and it was about, we need green energy. Well, green energy comes with its own issues, such as it being unreliable without specific conditions, such as enough wind or sun. There was an example in Broken Hill last year where there were power issues for several weeks after a storm disrupted the grid. Yes, we have power outages during storms, even without renewables, but they don't cause lingering impacts after the power has been restored. Additionally, the upfront costs of green energy are super expensive, and in many cases they don't actually recoup the cost of what it took to build the green energy source in the first place. I have also seen some anecdotes that solar doesn't actually save that much in costs, and in my state of Victoria, where it's not as sunny as Queensland or West Australia, you can't take as much advantage of solar anyway. So those arguments were for the cost side of things, but if you're talking about saving the environment, well, Australia only produces about 1% of the total CO2 emissions. China emits almost 33%, and we're selling cheap energy to China. Meanwhile, it's more expensive here than it is overseas. So if you want to save the planet, why are we still exporting fossil fuels to the largest CO2 emitter in the world? My point is, green energy is more costly than one might think, and Australia doesn't even emit that much CO2 anyway. Now, I'm not saying green energy is 100% bad, but I am providing the other side of the argument. The comment just said we need green energy, or we need to go green or something. They didn't say why, which is fine, it wasn't the point of the comment, but I am just providing the other side of the argument. Precisely why do we need to go fully green? If it's for cost effectiveness, why is the upfront cost so large? And why is the ongoing maintenance of some methods such as wind so expensive? If it's to save the environment, why do we send fossil fuels to China? Shouldn't we also be cutting that if we want to save the planet? Just providing the other side of the argument here. Another comment was DOGE is dumb. My thoughts on DOGE can be summarized as follows.
Involving DOGE right now, there's so much hyperventilating BS. And like, oh, a federal judge said this, and oh my God, he's literally Hitler. Like, okay, yeah, all that political stupidity. But at the end of the day, our government wastes money on a scale that is just mind-boggling. And somebody has to do something about it. Is Elon Musk the best man for the job? I don't know. Probably not. He's the one person in the freaking world that is trying to cut United States government spending, and everybody hates him for it. Oh, well, boo-hoo. Spending cuts are hard. Austerity sucks. It has to happen, or we're all going to burn. So good luck. That's all I can say. I hope you cut spending. It's going to suck for the people who are dependent on the programs they're cutting. Life sucks. Life is hard. Resources are finance. Guys, we need to cut spending. That's my thoughts on that one.
Yeah, it's not perfect, but you cannot tell me the government is efficient with their spending. My internship was at a government agency. It was at the tax office. And I can tell you, there is so much inefficiency there. People were slow at their job, multiple people looking at one thing that could just be done by one expert, some people who couldn't even use Excel properly back in 2019 despite having an office job, and I know people in my personal life who work for the government, and I see their Insta stories of them goofing off at work. If you're defending those kinds of workers, it makes me think that you don't actually have any valuable real-world skills, and you'd struggle with employment in the private sector, hence why you're very anti-DOGE. A cushy taxpayer-funded job is your only hope of a decent income. It's not perfect, but it's way better than just leaving things alone. You gotta break a few eggs to make an omelette. It's also funny because I criticized the government spending millions on pandas in that video, and not a single person defended this. You could build at least several social houses with that money, but you've spent it on 2 pandas. Defend that. Oh wait, someone did, and guess what their defense was? They were like, oh, the pandas increase tourism, and they will also lead to medical breakthroughs after scientists can run tests on them. I'm not kidding, I had some comment along those lines. Hey genius, 2 pandas are not going to recoup millions of dollars in costs. That'll barely impact tourism. And I have no idea what you're yapping about with your science experiment thing. Do you have a source for that? Yeah, it's called common sense. Tourists aren't going to flock to one zoo because they have 2 pandas. And do you have a source for that science comment you made? No one is providing any sources other than me here. Everyone is just yapping, which again is fine. Engagement is engagement. Piggybacking off the DOGE comment, a large comment that received a lot of likes mentioned that DOGE cutting the Federal Aviation Administration staff was leading to more air traffic incidents in 2025. Well, they didn't actually provide proof, but no doubt they were referring to the collision in DC, where a helicopter crashed into a plane, killing 67 people. Well, this occurred on the 29th of January, and DOGE didn't start cutting jobs until late February. The collision had nothing to do with DOGE layoffs. Even so, if you looked at that incident, both aircraft were in contact with air traffic control, so it's not as if there was no one there because DOGE laid them off. Another incident is the recent Hudson River crash, where a helicopter plummeted into the river. Well, this helicopter didn't crash into anything, so the FAA had nothing to do with this. It was more than likely some engineering issue. If they're referring to the Boeing incidents with Boeing planes falling apart, most of that was in 2024, before DOGE was even a thing. Now, the long comment that involved this argument had a shitload of likes, so one would see that comment and think they had a point because that comment had a lot of likes. Well, they were wrong relating to that. There is zero proof that DOGE cuts have resulted in more aviation accidents. But because my video got suggested to a bunch of Jordies fans who lack the ability to think critically, I'm the one who looks like an idiot. Another common argument that I already kind of mentioned was, you're an idiot, and then providing zero reasons as to why. Well, as I mentioned earlier in the video, I was smart enough to get my CPA, I was smart enough to get a net worth of almost $300,000 at the age of 28, I was smart enough to get my own 4-bedroom house, aka it's not a shitty 2-bedroom apartment. I was smart enough to figure out how to be aesthetic, even despite working 7 days a week with CPA study. I was smart enough to trade stocks and the whole monetized YouTube channel thing. If I'm such an idiot, how are you going with life? Another argument was Labor is helping people get into housing. Their policies are helping the housing crisis. Lol, no they're not. Neither is the coalition's. But here we go again. Labor is perfect, coalition is arse. Where's the critical thinking? Where's the other side of the argument? Labor's Help to Buy scheme, buying a house with only a 5% deposit with no LMI, it's all adding more demand to housing. I showed the example earlier. Government incentives adding demand to housing only raises the house prices even further. If you don't believe me, give it 2 years for these policies to flow through to housing. Watch it continue to spike up. Another argument was your right-wing bias. Lol, okay, so Jordies is okay to be left-wing bias, but I can't be right-wing bias? Even though a few comments said it was noteworthy how I was fair to both sides. Again, they missed the point. I was arguing only for one side in that reaction segment, because the guy I was reacting to also only shows one side of the argument, so I was trying to be a mirror. I actually made arguments for both sides earlier in the video, but I guess Jordies fans aren't smart enough to realize there was actually a whole 10-minute segment prior. But I argued for one side to counteract the bias. And hey, guess what? Yeah, I do lean right-wing, so I do have a bit of right-wing bias. I have this thing in my body called testosterone. Of course I'm right-wing bias. Left-wing bias is for the bitch tits soy boys. Even your own women admit you have no testosterone in your body.
Who are the cuties in the Democratic Party that are speaking?
Oh, I don't know. Talk to anyone who lives in D.C. It's hard to find a cute Democrat.
Oh my God, shots fired.
No, that's the tea. Ask anyone who lives in D.C. and who works in Democratic politics. It's hard to find the cute ones.
The Republican guys are hotter?
Yeah, but they're evil. So, I don't know.
We kind of love evil. Oh my God.
I feel like
You are so bad.
But they are doing so in trying to put forward male figures, Tim Walz being one of them, Doug Emhoff last night, who can speak to men out there who might not be the sort of testosterone-laden, gun-toting kind of guy who wants to listen to Hulk Hogan and the kind of players that came out of the RNC.
But that aside, what proof do you have that I was right-wing bias? Because I was criticizing a left-wing bias argument? So is it only okay to be biased if you're biased left-wing? Classic leftists whinging when things don't go their own way. Why don't you go paint a SWAT sticker on a Tesla while you're at it? I have another argument that I'd like the Labour Party defenders to talk about. We had 7 negative GDP per capita prints in a row. Are you going to hear this from FriendlyJordies, or are you going to not mention anything negative about your own political party? Also, another thing that was mentioned a few times in the comments was Labour had a budget surplus. The primary reason they did was due to higher commodity prices, something they have no control over. It was luck they hit this budget surplus. It's the same way how in the mid-2010s, Alan Joyce gave himself a big bonus because he, apparently, cut the fuel costs for Qantas planes, even though the only reason that fuel costs were so low back then was due to something happening in the Middle East. They were trying to flood the market with oil to drown out US suppliers or something like that. Point is, he was taking credit for something he didn't really do. It's the same thing here. The higher commodity prices contributed to the budget surplus. Labor didn't do anything specific here. Also, did anyone make any comments on the upcoming projected budget deficit? Yeah, you had a surplus. Kudos. But what about the future? Are we going to just ignore that? The Labor Party can do no wrong, hey? So those are basically all the arguments I wanted to clear up. There was a fair few longer comments that were pretty insightful and intelligent, but I responded to those in said comments. Now, before I conclude the video, again, I'm not a partisan for the coalition, despite what a lot of Redditors in my last comments section seem to think, but even if I was a coalition partisan, that's not okay, but Jordies being the biggest Labor partisan in existence is okay. Here are some arguments against the coalition. Their nuclear plan won't work, and it's a big part of their policy, although I did see in the recent campaign speeches they barely mentioned it, since they know it's a bad one. They're going to lose the election. If you backdate historical polls at this point in time before an election, using the current numbers and the policies of either party, Labor is going to get re-elected. I do like the coalition's gas reservation policy, but they couldn't really explain how they were going to do it. Should have prepared better. Their recent plans to help first home buyers is also only going to make the housing situation worse, and it somewhat feels like a desperate Hail Mary. And I defended Labor enough earlier in this video. Now, name me one instance where FriendlyJordies showed that kind of ability to think critically and argue for both sides. The only instance I recall is some freedom of speech bill, but that's only one case. He recently tried to argue how the student debt system in Australia was good, but he missed the whole point of how it used to be free. Once again, he's only presenting one side of the argument, but I was glad to see the comments were giving him a reality check there. Next time you hear an opinion from someone, think critically, delve into the reasons why. Example, in the video reaction, Jordies used some outdated data from 2021, but then used it in a video in 2025, and despite the fact he showed actual data, I decided to dig into it and look myself, and found out he was wrong. One comment did give me props for that, but according to other comments, I did no research. Do the same with this video. Is there something you're sus of that I've said? Delve into it. And don't take my word for it. Do your own homework on it. Or you can just leave a comment calling me an idiot, or saying I'm biased, or saying I shouldn't have an opinion because I haven't been following politics for 40 years. The engagement has been real good. Been up a good 20 plus subscribers since. Yeah, the views to sub ratio wasn't that good at all, but it was better than nothing. Engagement is also engagement. The video keeps gaining traction because people can't resist making comments. Even after finishing typing this huge ass script, there's still new comments, and they're all along the same lines. Saying I'm biased without giving an example, saying I'm not entitled to an opinion if this is my first rodeo, despite not arguing against a single thing I said. Same thing happened with my Adonis school video. A lot of comments said, you didn't even buy the course / buy into the school. How can you comment on it? And yet no one debunked a thing I said. They didn't say, oh, you were wrong about his career advice, or you were wrong about his relationship advice, etc. Same energy here. But I will say, once again, I did appreciate the engagement. I also appreciated how unbelievably biased a lot of people are towards one side of the aisle. You've just basically confirmed for me that Labor will win the election, meaning I can load up on a huge gamble, thus making me some fat coin. So thank you, Labor partisans, for indirectly telling me that Labor will win the election. Now I can profit off this by gambling on it, as well as having my home further increase in value, even though that would have happened even if the coalition got in. So have at it in the comments, debunk stuff I said in this video with facts and reasoning, or don't, just comment, just say anything. Keep that sweet, sweet engagement rolling in. My career is going well, my personal finances are going well, my investments are going well, my training in the gym is going well. I only needed a bit of a boost in my brand, and welp, I've got it. So thanks for the promotion, and thanks for watching. That is all.